What's up, everyone? So today we are taking a look at the WIZ Cloud Security Championship. Now, this is going to be a 12-month capture the flag that WIZ is releasing over the course of the next year. So as you can see, we've got the June 2025 challenge here. I did this like a week or so ago, so that one's available. And then July is coming up, sometime this month. So I'll do another walkthrough video of that. But let's go ahead and jump into the perimeter leak challenge. So this challenge was created by Scott Piper. Now, Scott Piper is a well-known security researcher, has published a whole bunch of stuff about AWS security. So definitely check out his work. But it looks like he created this challenge here, and let's go ahead and kick it off. So perimeter leak. After weeks of exploits and privilege escalation, you've gained access to what you hope is the final server that you can then use to extract out the secret flag from an S3 bucket. It won't be easy though. The target uses an AWS data perimeter to restrict access to the bucket contents. Now we can go ahead, we could do this locally on our machine, or we could just go ahead and use this terminal here. So we have this hint here. You've discovered a Spring Boot Actuator application running on AWS. Curl this endpoints, and then get this status up. So if you don't know what Spring Boot Actuator is, it's a Java-based application. Basically, it helps developers spin up production-ready applications. We can go ahead and look at the actual documentation for Spring Boot. And then there's these endpoints that can optionally be enabled here. So these API endpoints could be audit events, env for environment variables. There's a health endpoints. There's a mappings endpoint that tells you which API endpoints are enabled, as well as a bunch of other stuff that you may or may not have access to and may or may not be enabled. So this is definitely good to know if you've never used the Actuator endpoint before. So let's try this Actuator health endpoint. We'll go back to the challenge, and then we're going to curl this endpoint here. All right, so we'll curl the URL Actuator health, and then this gives us that status up. So we kind of know that we're like on the right track here for this challenge. It's going to be related to, we're hitting the right endpoints. So let's see what we can do here. We know that there is a env, so environment variables, but let's go to the mappings first, because the mappings is going to tell us what kind of endpoints are enabled. So Actuator mappings. As you can see here, we have all of this jumble of JSON data, it looks like. That's a little bit messy and hard to read. And so what we can do is we can try to parse this data out. So I worked on this JQ query here. So JQ is a CLI tool. I've made other videos about it, but it allows us to parse the information and return just what we want here. So this query right here is just going to return the endpoints that are going to be enabled. And as you can see, much easier to read here. So we've got all these Actuator endpoints. A lot of these look familiar, right? Health, mappings, env, we saw those in the documentation. But what we didn't see was these other ones, /proxy, /error, right? So these are non-standard endpoints. And if we want to dive more into the proxy one, now we can query that same endpoint. We'll get the same information as we did before, but I'm just selecting the information about that proxy endpoint. So this is all in that jumble of JSON data, of course, just easier to read here. So it looks like someone added this /proxy endpoint with a parameter of URL. So probably indicates that there's a proxy running on the system, and that we could pass it a URL, and then it'll interact with that URL. So we'll want to confirm that. But before we jump in there, we know that the env endpoint is enabled. So let's go ahead and check that out first. We'll just go back to the endpoint, Actuator env, and I mistyped that. I had 2 slashes. There we go. So again, a whole bunch of JSON code here. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. And then we're going to throw it up into Visual Studio Code here. And then I had just created this file. I'll just start over here. We'll just paste that in, everything we had. We'll get rid of that CLI right there. We'll save the file, and then it's going to format the code appropriately. And then there we go. So prints out the JSON and a little bit more of an easier way to read, right? So the cool thing is we can see the system properties. We can see that it is running an EC2 instance because we have this EC2 user that would typically indicate this is an EC2 instance, Amazon Inc. We can see information about the Java version. And then if we scroll down a bit, we can get the environment variables here. So as we can see, we get the home path is set to home EC2 user. It's using bash. And then the cool thing is we have this bucket here. This is probably an S3 bucket. We know that the flag is going to be in S3. Let's go ahead and copy this. Now let's see if we can hit that bucket. So we could try to do it from the browser. It works a little bit differently from the browser than it would from a CLI. And then it has a standard naming convention. So it's going to be .s3.amazonaws.com. Looks like we get access denied. Okay, so that didn't work. Let's go ahead and curl it. We'll do a capital I there, and then that's going to just return the headers. So again, .s3, amazonaws.com. All right, so this gives us the headers. It's indeed an Amazon S3 bucket, and we can see that the region for the bucket is US East 1. Okay, so at least we know where it's at now. We get a little bit more information. One thing we could try to do is see if we have permissions to that bucket. And so we can see if AWS is installed, the CLI tool, and it looks like it is. We can see who we are, if the challenge has given us any kind of identity, and it looks like we don't. We have nothing here in the current directory. Let's see if this file exists here. So anytime you set up AWS credentials, it creates this file here. Unless it's like an SSO user, it goes into a different file. But it looks like no files exist. Okay, so we have the CLI, we just don't have any permissions. So what we can try to do is we can try to list this bucket here. So we'll do AWS S3 LS. We'll pass in the bucket name. Now, when I run this, actually, if we go back to the version of AWS, yeah, we can see it's using version 2.x of the CLI. So starting with version 2, the CLI now signs your request using any credentials you have set up. We've just confirmed we don't have any credentials set up. And so if we run this command here, it's going to fail. So we're going to try to list the bucket contents. What the CLI is doing is it's going to try to grab our credentials and sign the request and then send it, and it's going to fail and give us this unable to locate credentials error message. And so we don't have credentials, so we can't send this request. One thing we can do though is we can pass in this parameter, this no sign request. This is saying, hey, don't sign my request. In other words, we're essentially running this as like an anonymous user. And we can see that that bucket doesn't allow that. It's access denied. So we can't list the bucket contents. Maybe we could list the bucket objects though. So instead of S3, we'll do the S3 API, and then we'll do list object versions, and then we'll pass in the bucket name. There we go. Pass in that bucket name. Let's see if we can list the object versions. And again, it's going to fail. I forgot the no sign request. All right, so we can't list the object versions. We could try to get bucket policy and see if that works here. And it's going to fail. Okay, so we at least have the bucket name. We know the region it exists in. We just don't have any permissions to it. We could try running all sorts of other AWS S3 commands to see if we have access. But we're not going to. And so we know we found that proxy endpoint earlier, right? So /proxy with a parameter of URL. So let's go ahead and try to do that then. We are going to curl, let me get the endpoint here. And it's /proxy, and then we're going to do a question mark for the parameter of URL equals, and then let's just try to do like, I don't know, google.com and see if that works. All right, so expected value like check ip.amazonaws.com. This proxy passes along headers and different request paths. This proxy can only be used to contact host names that match IP addresses or include amazonaws.com. All right. So that can kind of give us a hint. We know that this is an EC2 bucket. So let's kind of look at this. We've got a VPC, which is where a EC2 will live. Okay, so I'm going to put in now we have an EC2 here. And we know that it's in the region. I'm going to put it like this. We know it's in the region US East 1. And then we know that there's an S3 bucket. Now an S3 bucket lives outside of a VPC. So I'm going to put it over here, S3. And we also know it's in US East 1. So this is kind of where we're at. And then we also know that there's a proxy on this EC2. So an EC2 can have what's called an instance metadata service. It's essentially like a local service that runs on the EC2, and it has a whole bunch of different properties. Amazon's got a bunch of documentation here. For example, we could get the image that the EC2 is running. We can get information about its storage drives, its host name. This is the one that we want to key in on, though, is does our EC2 have access to a role? So you can have IAM roles attached to an EC2. Now, we know that there's an application running on this. We saw the S3 buckets in the environment variables. So we could assume here that that application has access to this S3 bucket, and it probably does so via an IAM role, because that's typically how you would design that architecture in AWS. So we would have up here, we'd have an IAM role, and then that gets attached to an EC2, and then that happens via an instance profile. And then that instance profile can have permissions giving that EC2 or any applications running on that EC2 access to different resources, for example, S3. So we can assume that's maybe the architecture here, but we don't know yet. So let's go ahead and go back, and then let's see if we can curl the instance metadata service. So we're going to curl the same EC2, but now we're doing the proxy endpoint with the URL parameter, and we're passing in the instance metadata service, which is available here at this URL. We run this, and we get this unauthorized error message. So typically that probably means that we need a token. That means that version 1, there's two different versions of IMDS. There's version 1, there's version 2. Version 2 requires a token. And so let's try to grab a token. So again, we're going to query that EC2 proxy URL. This time we're hitting this other endpoint API token. This should give us a token if IMDS2 is running. And I'm missing a, there we go. Okay, so it looks like it worked. We can go ahead and echo out the token there. And here's our token. So now we have to pass this token to subsequent request to the metadata service, and that's going to authenticate us and allow us to query IMDS. So again, we'll just curl that same endpoint as before. The difference here is now we're passing that token. And here we go. Here's all the different categories. So if we want to get the host name here, we get the host name. If we wanted to get the region, placement/region. Instead of host name, we're going to do placement/region. Now we're confirming that the EC2 is in fact in US East 1. And I may have jumped the gun there. I don't remember now. But yeah, so we just confirmed that the EC2 is in US East 1. We have access to the IMDS service via this proxy endpoint. Now let's go ahead and enumerate and see if there's like an IAM role attached to it. We can do IAM info, and that gives us the name of the role. Like for example, info. We can see that, okay, there is a role or an instance profile attached. That gives us the name, or we could just simply do security-credentials, and that will also tell us the role name. We copy that. We'll do security credentials again, pass in the role name, and now we have the credentials. So now we can confirm that there is an IAM role attached to it. It's this challenge here. All right, so we have a role attached to it, to the EC2. We don't yet know if it has access to S3. We'll find that out, but now we have the credentials. And so a role is going to have temporary credentials, hence we have this session token here. So I'm going to copy the access key ID, and we're going to set up AWS configure, and we'll set up our credentials here. Pass in the access key. Now we'll get the secret key. We know we're in US East 1. And then I'm going to do the default output format as JSON. You don't have to do these bottom two, but this is kind of what I like to do is JSON. And then we can run AWS STS get caller identity. And then this is going to fail because it says invalid client token ID. The security token included in the request is invalid. And so what that means is we need this session token. So we'll copy the session token. I'm going to clear my screen. We're going to do the AWS configure again, but this time we're going to pass in set and then AWS underscore session token. Just like that. And now when we run AWS STS get caller identity, we should be the instance role. And we are. So we're that challenge role. So now we have whatever permissions this role has. All right, so more than likely, we probably do have access to S3. Let's go ahead and confirm that. So we can do AWS S3 ls, and then we'll pass in the bucket name here, just like that. We don't have to do the no sign request anymore because now we have credentials as that EC2 profile. And so it's going to use those credentials, sign this request. Let's see. There we go. So we now have access to the S3 buckets. And then there's a couple files in there, as well as a directory or a prefix is actually what it's called. It's called a prefix, but you can think of it like a directory or a folder path because we see the slash in here. So let's go ahead and try to get the hello.txt and see what that is. So instead of listing the file, I'm going to copy the file. Now we can copy it like this, where we just specify the local path, and then that's going to download the file if we have permissions to do so. It looks like we do. So, and then we can just cat that file. We can see welcome to the proxy server. Okay. So nothing super helpful there. The other thing we can do though is instead of downloading the file, we can just specify dash at the end, and then this will just print out the contents of that file, which in this case will be welcome to the proxy server. There we go. Okay, so again, not helpful. So let's go back up here, and then instead of CP, we're going to do ls for list. You know, we don't know how deep this directory is. We could just list it one by one, like we could type in private here. But instead, I'm going to pass in this parameter of recursive, and this will go ahead and essentially enumerate all of the prefixes and files in the bucket, provided we have permission to do so. Okay, so we have the hello.txt. Now we can see that there's one file in that private prefix. If there were other files in here and we didn't have access to them, we would have some error messages. But as we can see, this is all that's in that S3 bucket, this file and then this flag.txt. So there's our flag. So let's see if we can go ahead and get to it. So again, instead of copying it locally, we'll do private flag.txt. Okay, failed to download. So I don't have permissions to download it as the EC2 role. We could try instead to get object versions. Maybe there's a different version of that flag. Get objects or list object versions. List object versions. Pass in the bucket name. Okay, don't have access to perform that. So one other thing we can try to do is S3 API is we can try to get the bucket policy and see if it tells us what permissions we need. Okay, so we get this policy document back here. This is saying effect deny principal star. So deny all principals, all AWS principals in any account. The action to get this object, and the object being the bucket, private, and anything within that private prefix. So in our case, we have one file in that private prefix, which is flag.txt. This bucket policy is denying all principals, so everyone, the ability to get anything, to get that flag, unless this VPC endpoint is in the request. So what does that mean? So if we go back here, Typically, the way things work is anytime you run an AWS command, it could be from your local machine or it could be from our EC2. So if we try to do list S3 buckets, it goes out to the public internet. So you would have like an internet gateway attached to your VPC, and you would have like a route table and all that. I'm just going to simplify things, but you're going to go out to the public internet, and then you're going to hit this API endpoint. So there's an S3 API endpoint. I don't know it off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up, but it would hit that endpoint. And then from there, it would go and hit S3. But because, or not because, but we can see that there's a condition that says, hey, access to this bucket must come from this VPC endpoint. Now, we don't know. We can try to list endpoints. So we can do AWS EC2 list. Hold on one second. What's the command? Like AWS EC2 describe VPC endpoints. Or maybe there's a list too. List. No. So it's describe VPC endpoints. Let's see if we have permissions to that. We don't. I think, let's see. Describe VPC endpoints. Can we pass in VPC endpoint IDs? We have the VPC endpoint ID. So let's go ahead and try this. VPC endpoint ID being this. Let's see if we have permissions to enumerate this a bit. And again, we don't have any permissions. So we have no idea what kind of VPC endpoint this is. We can assume it's an S3 one. We can assume that it's in our VPC because the EC2 supposedly should be able to talk to S3 and we have S3 permissions. So what happens when you have a VPC endpoint? This is what it looks like here is you would have a VPC endpoint attached, and there's different types of endpoints depending on the AWS service. I'm going to assume that this one, the one that we found, is for S3. It would just make sense. And so what happens when you have a VPC endpoint for S3 is now internal resources, so in this case our EC2, rather than talk out to the public internet to this endpoint, we have this VPC endpoint, and it's going to force the EC2 to talk to this VPC endpoint. And then from there, it's talking to S3. So that's how that would work. So we can't interact with this S3 bucket unless we do so from the EC2. So now what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to generate what's called an S3 pre-signed URL. So a pre-signed URL essentially gives, you define a bucket, you define the objects in that bucket, and you create this URL using the credentials. In this case, we're going to use the credentials of the role here, and we're going to generate this URL to the path of the flag. So we have AWS S3 pre-sign, and then we'll have the path to the bucket and the flag. All right, so we may or may not have permissions to pre-sign. The reason why I'm suggesting we do this is because the only way we can interact with this EC2 is through this proxy endpoint. We don't have any kind of code execution on the EC2 other than running like curl. So we wouldn't be able to do like, who am I? Like we don't have that kind of access because again, the proxy is configured to only query things with .amazon AWS inside of it. And so if we generate a pre-signed URL, this is going to give us a URL. And it does have the Amazon AWS in here, which was a requirement based off of that proxy message, not this one, but the one that we saw earlier. So now we have this URL. And again, we could copy this, and in theory, you could go to your browser and access it. But we still get that message, explicit deny in a resource-based policy. That's because we're not coming from that VPC endpoint. So we need to take this URL here, and then we need to pass it into the proxy endpoints. So we'll curl, and then we're going to take this URL, pass it to the proxy, parentheses, run that, and we get this bad request. So more than likely, we're just having issues with the formatting of our URL. So let's go ahead and try to URL encode that. So what we can do here is we can run the same commands. So we get the pre-sign, here's the path, and then we can pass it to, there's different tools we can use. I'm going to use JQ, and then we'll do -s, -r, -lowercase r, at URI. So if we run this, we're going to get a URL that's now encoded. And so let's go ahead and save this into a variable. So we'll do pre-signed URL. Of course, this could be whatever you want to call it. Now it's saved to a variable. I'm going to clear the screen. And we can echo that pre-signed URL. There it is. And so now we just want to curl this endpoint via that proxy. All right, so like the way this is going to work is we've got this URL. We created this pre-signed URL. So now we're going from the EC2 proxy, we're hitting the VPC endpoints, and then we're trying to hit this pre-signed URL, which in reality is this flag in here. So when we send this request, we tried the request in our browser, it doesn't work. Instead, we're going to go to the EC2 instance, run it through its proxy. That request, because it's S3 related, is going to hit the VPC endpoints. And then it's going to go to that pre-signed URL, which will take us to the flag.txt in the S3 bucket. So that's the way it's going to work. And here's our flag. So there we go, everyone. So that was the challenge. I hope you enjoyed the walkthrough, and thanks for watching.